The Jangali movement in Iran was a rebellion against the monarchist rule of the central government of the Sublime State of Iran, which lasted from October of 1915 to June 1920, led by Mirza Kuchik Khan, which would end up creating the Persian Socialist Soviet Republic in northwest Persia, south of the Caspian Sea. It lasted until June of 1920 until September of 1921, 7 months after the signing of the Russo-Persian Treaty. But what if, in an alternate timeline, Iran fell to the Bolsheviks at the end of World War I? But first, some context of the region during the war. Just as a heads up, I'm going to be interchanging the terms Iran and Persia a lot, and they both mean the same country. Got it? Great. Persia during the Great War had seen the Germans cross through the country and try to get Afghanistan to join the war, but they were unsuccessful. Also, the British and Russians sent task forces through Persia against the German and Ottoman forces throughout the war. The conflict proved to be devastating for Persia's experience. Over 2 million Persian civilians died in the conflict, mostly due to the Armenian genocide committed by the Ottoman regime. And of course, there was also the Persian famine from 1917 to 1919. But you see, there was one other factor which plagued Persia, and that was the Jangali movement. The Jangali movement, which had begun in 1915, had the goal of overthrowing the monarchy through revolution led by Kuchik Khan. Initially, the movement saw a strong peasant and working class support and would engage in guerrilla warfare against the British and Russians, whom they saw as invaders. After the Russian Revolution in 1917, however, Marxists within Iran became more organized and began collaborating with the Jangalis, and many of these new Jangali revolutionaries directly became influenced by the Bolsheviks. Later on in the war, when the British Dunster Force went through Persia on their way to Baku, Kuchik Khan made a vow to not allow the British through. However, he had mistakenly thought that all of the former Russian soldiers passing through the country would join the British if attacked. So Khan initially avoided conflict, but the Russian exodus through Khan's territory had allowed his forces to purchase many cheap rifles and ammunition. Red Guards then came to Baku to arrest the Dunster Force, but they just missed them as the British turned back during the winter. Kuchik Khan then claimed that he was the one who attacked the British if they came back, and many in the country then believed that the British were turned back by Khan. However, this was not the case. In 1918, the Jangalis prepared to march, but were attacked by Chernikov's Cossacks in Kazian with British support, which prevented Khan from taking Tehran, which would have been essentially undefended. Mirza Kuchik Khan's troops were then defeated in the Battle of Manjil against the British and Cossacks because of their combined use of artillery, armored cars, and airplanes. Mirza's field commander was also a German officer named Major von Paschen, who joined the Jangali movement after being released by them from a British prison, and keep that in mind. Conditions to produce a Jangali victory, march on Tehran, and therefore a conquest of Persia to create a Bolshevik state would be if there was no British Dunster Force to make their trip to Baku. This would do two things. One, it would make much of southwestern Persia starve as the British had conducted mass famine relief operations. But two, it would also mean that Khan allows Chernikov's Cossacks to pass through his territory on their way to the Caucasus instead of opposing them. Therefore, there is no battle between the Jangalis, and Tehran is taken unopposed. In May of 1920, the actual Soviet Republic of Iran would officially become known as the Iranian Soviet Socialist Republic. The Republic did not redistribute the land to poor peasants, to the dismay of the more radical forces of the Jangali movement. Therefore, soon disagreements arose between Mirza and his group of advisors on the one side, and the Soviets and the Communist Party of Persia on the other. So I feel like if this is replicated across the entire territory which the Jangalis gained from the conquest of Tehran, it would further escalate into inter-communist tensions in the country. In our timeline, the Soviet Republic fell about a year later, so it was very short-lived, and a lot of the disagreements didn't have too much time to amount to anything just due to how fast the Soviets withdrew. Actually, the great split between Stalin and Trotsky about Soviet policy traces its origins to the Iranian Soviet Socialist Republic. Anyway, with a larger Jangali conquest, these disagreements would be over a larger area of territory and over a longer period of time, which would have massive consequences which I can't accurately determine. However, it's Bolshevism during the Russian Civil War, so you know things would get very bloody. Because the Jangalis control Tehran, that doesn't necessarily mean that all of Iran will be taken over by them. However, all of the British sources that I've gone through point to this being the likely case, as do some of the translated Iranian sources. So I'll go with this outcome of a Jangali takeover of Iran in 1918, which therefore causes the Bolsheviks to have a greater influence in the country. But the real question is, will Afghanistan also fall to Bolshevism? And to that I say it would depend on the Entente response in Iran. I believe that the Entente would obviously respond to what they see as a Bolshevik Persia with great alarm. Since the Central Powers had played a direct role in creating the Bolshevik situation in Russia and forcing the country to drop out of the war, one angle which the Entente might see the Jangali takeover as a German and Ottoman plot. Other examples of Germans in the Middle East were Wilhelm Vasmus of Persia and attempts by the Germans and Ottomans in the Hindu-German conspiracy to try to get a pan-Indian rebellion in the British Raj. Also, the fact that Kuchik Khan has a German field commander would strengthen the British view that the Jangalis are allied with the Germans. Now, in our timeline, the British had sent troops into Persia against both the Central Powers and the invasion and the Jangalis on their way to Baku. However, since the Dunster Force and their expedition to Baku did not happen as a condition for a Jangali takeover of the country, in this alternate timeline the British have less troops there and are more in Iraq. Therefore, the British will be sending an invasion force into Persia to support the deposed monarchy and what is left of the Qajari military. This Anglo-Jangali war would also likely see the starving and desperate population be more on the pro-British side of things instead of supporting the Jangalis and the Bolsheviks for three main reasons. One, the British would do famine relief operations just like the Dunster Force had done, but this will be on a much larger scale. Second is because the population had turned strongly against Germany and the Ottoman Empire during the Great War and saw Britain as a better force to be with. And lastly, because the Bolsheviks and Jangalis would purge the living crap out of the population upon seizing power. After Britain wins this war, which would likely go past World War I and perhaps into the early 1920s, with the Jangalis and Bolsheviks eventually turning on one another despite the Jangalis needing Bolshevik support in the war. But remember, they didn't really get along well with each other in a short period of time in a small area, and there's this alternate timeline they're together for years controlling all of Iran. After the British are victorious, they reinstall the Qajar monarchy with a strongman government to prevent any further uprisings, as well as get some sweet oil deals. The aftermath of the war would first see a rather authoritarian monarchy in Iran which represses the population's political involvement after the famine ends. For the Bolsheviks, it's possible that their disaster with the Jangalis neutralizes the Trotskyist thought of global revolution a lot earlier, and Trotsky has a lot fewer supporters. Therefore, the Soviets follow more along the line of socialism in one country's model of the 1920s, put forth by Stalin and Bukharin. For Britain, the war was a monetary, costly endeavor, but would emphasize Britain's need to remain vigilant and involved in the Middle East against fears of Bolshevism. And in an ideal world, I would say this causes them to support the Kingdom of Hejaz against the Kingdom of Saud in the Arabian Peninsula, but that may be wishful thinking. This is of course just one possible scenario about if Kuchik Khan and the Bolsheviks took over Iran in 1918. What do you think would have happened? Let me know in the comments, and thank you for watching.